court has ruled that the prosecution failed to prove that the merger between Samsung C&T and Jail Industries was a crime committed to aid Ijeong's succession, and that it was an unfair merger that caused damage to shareholders. And the prevailing response in the Korean media was that Lee is now free from the legal risks he faced since the presidential corruption scandal in 2016. And some major foreign news outlets, including the New York Times and CNN, used the term surprise ruling in their reports about Lee being acquitted of all 19 charges. So can you share your own thoughts on this ruling?
I have a lot to say on this because this is a topic I've followed for so many years, more than a decade now. So just some background, back when this case originally happened, back when President Park Geun-hye was being impeached and the Samsung vice chairman at the time, Lee Jae-yong, he was being tried and being investigated for alleged bribery. I was writing my book, Samsung Rising, just as that was happening. And it was so fascinating to see it unfold because I had started writing the book before any of this happened. I mean, I started writing my book, when the big story was Apple versus Samsung. Everybody wanted to hear about the smartphone wars and who's going to win. Is it going to be the Galaxy or the iPhone? And as I was writing it, suddenly, there were protests in Seoul. There were, people out in the streets. It was the biggest protests in the history of the democratic nation. I mean, it was massive. And I was just so surprised to see it and to be there and to witness that, to witness history happening as I was writing my book. I was doing a lot of research on this. I had interviewed people at the Blue House. I had interviewed people in the National Pension Service, which was involved in this scandal. I interviewed so many current and former Samsung executives as this was happening to try to understand what was really going on the inside. And what everybody told me, and also what I believed based on my own research into this topic, was that Lee Jae-yong would be let off in the end, that he would not spend much time in prison. Maybe he would spend some time in prison, and he did spend time in prison. But in the end, he would be exonerated, and he would not have these charges carried against him. Now, that said, it did take a lot longer than I think people anticipated. I mean, this all started back in 2016 and 2017, and now it's 2024, so we're talking 7 to 8 years of criminal charges against the Samsung chairman, including prison time. That's a long time to deal with all of this, but in the end, he was exonerated and he was victorious. So the question is, why is this? People often ask me, why would this be the case? And, particularly outside of Korea, there are so many investors and, hedge funds and shareholders, groups that are interested in the chaebol and in Korean companies and how they operate. And, they're not familiar with how this kind of thing works. It's not something that they've seen before. And they'll often ask, why is it that a chairman keeps getting let off whenever there's a criminal charge? That's something that they're always concerned about because they're the ones who are, investing in shares, and they're worried that if there's a criminal corruption trial, the value of their share price will fall, and, they're going to make a loss on that share, on that stock sale. So this is a pattern. This is something that has existed almost universally among Korean chaebol groups. And it comes down to the fact the founding families of these companies are the centerpiece of the economy. They're influential, they're powerful. They were responsible for much of the nation building from the 1960s to 1980s. And they always had a special place in the political system because of their contributions to the nation. The fact of the matter is that, I've gone over all of the evidence. I mean, I have looked at all the evidence I could find. I've gone through, court documents, watched the hearings that are available, and there was a very strong criminal case against Lee Jae-yong. There was a lot of evidence to get him convicted, and he was convicted. And the fact that all 19 charges would be dropped is not really a result of the evidence being bad. It's that he's needed now, and there are people in the judicial system who I believe are sympathetic to him. The global semiconductor market is difficult. It's going through a rough patch. There's a growing demand for semiconductors with the current geopolitical tensions between, China, the US, other countries, Taiwan. Semiconductors are a centerpiece industry. And the fact of the matter is that it's chaebol groups like SK Hynix and Samsung that have the capital, they have the size, the vertical integration. They're some of the few companies in the world that can produce these chips at scale, and these companies are needed. I mean, the world economy needs them, the South Korean economy needs them. I think ultimately that's what leads to somebody like Lee Jae-yong being let off. In the end, there is a good case against him. It's very probable that he actually did deliver those bribes to the president's ally, and those bribes were used to side with Samsung in a merger that lost a lot of money for shareholders. That's the charge against him originally. There's a lot of evidence for that, but ultimately, people decided that it's in the national interest for Lee Jae-yong to be exonerated and running Samsung as the chairman.
How do you expect this ruling to affect Samsung Electronics and Samsung's overall competitiveness?
One of the things that Samsung always says is that it needs the chairman, it needs the Lee family. That's something that the public relations department has said over and over for many years. And they said this when his father, the former chairman Lee Kun-hee, was also criminally convicted for tax evasion. They've always said that they need the chairman. But the fact of the matter is that even when the chairman is gone, and even if the chairman can't run the company, Samsung has done quite well. I mean, we have to remember that this is one of the largest companies in the world. It's one of the most successful companies in the world. It is awash in capital. It often has the backing of the government for many of its projects in robotics and chips and AI and so forth. Samsung is not going anywhere, and the executives of Samsung, they are highly educated, highly competent. Many of them are the best in the nation. I mean, they've gotten so far in life, and they did it out of hard work and grit. They have done an incredible job. So I don't totally believe the line that, Samsung needs a family chairman in power who needs to coordinate them or lay down the vision. I think that's more of a public relations line, and it's something that the company has struggled more and more with over the years. It also used to be that, back when Samsung was a much smaller company, it was not as sophisticated. Dial back the clock 30 to 40 years, and they were making very basic semiconductors called DRAM chips. This is what you would use in calculators. It was not a major global company. Back then, it would make sense for the family to need control over the company. The family, for such a small company, for such a small, tight-knit group of people, it makes sense that there would be a family founder who can direct and control the direction of it. But nowadays, Samsung just does so much. There's no way that a family founder who's not an engineer, who's not trained in engineering, can possibly know all of these different business lines. I mean, he might lay down a vision, but it's not clear that that vision will necessarily work well for the display business. It might work for semiconductors, but it might not work for smartphones. The businesses are so big that it's very difficult to tie it all together into a single idea. And that's what Samsung's trying to do. They want Lee Jae-yong to be the idea behind Samsung, but that simply doesn't work anymore in the 21st century.
Last year, Samsung Electronics gave up its top spot among Korean businesses for the first time since the 2008 global financial crisis, as its operating profit fell far behind Hyundai and Kia Motors. And it's evaluated to be lagging behind Apple in the high-end smartphone market, and at the same time being chased by Chinese companies in the mid to low tier smartphone market. And some point out that it's failing to maintain its so-called super gap strategy for semiconductors compared to the past. So what's your assessment on Samsung's overall global competitiveness?
This is a problem that the former chairman of Samsung, Lee Kun-hee, the father of the current chairman, this is what he called the Samsung sandwich. He actually saw this happening. He foresaw this into the future. He first made these future predictions back in the 1990s, back when Samsung was first getting big. He said, right now we are a high volume company, high volume, low cost. We sell cheaper items, imitative items on the global market, which are not competitive. And as a result, we cannot compete with Sony and Apple and IBM and, the major companies of that time period. What he said is that as Samsung grows and becomes a major global company, we're going to run into the Samsung sandwich. And that is the tendency, having a major hardware business that's focused on high volume manufacturing, having to compete with a company like Apple, which controls the high end of the market with the iPhone, and then also having to compete with companies like Huawei and other Chinese firms, Xiaomi, for example, the bottom end of the market, and they have always been focused on high volume manufacturing. So Samsung, one of their biggest struggles over many years has been being stuck in that middle area, but wanting to control the higher end of the business. That's one of the reasons why they tried to compete with Apple, and they did it very successfully. I mean, Samsung makes more smartphones than any company company in the world, if I recall correctly. Those numbers change every year, but last I checked, Samsung, is one of the most profitable smartphone firms in the world still. They're trying to go after Apple in that space. They want to release the $1,000 phones, which are right next to the iPhone. But the struggle is that since their emphasis is on hardware and not software, they can get stuck in a business model in which they have to invest a lot of money into getting to the next hardware release, whereas Apple can invest a lot less because they rely on their software to keep the phones innovative, not only the hardware. But what this means is that Samsung naturally gets pushed into that middle space, and so the Chinese firms will be rapidly catching up with them, rapidly studying what they do, catching up to them on hardware. But then, since Samsung can't develop that software, it can't quite become the Apple that it wants to. I mean, look at what Apple's doing now. They just released their virtual reality headset. They've gone into Apple TV. They have a huge line of cutting edge multimedia businesses. Samsung has tried to do that. They were in virtual reality a while back. They dropped that business line. Samsung has tried to go into AI. They haven't done so well in that area either because they're a hardware company. And so what this means is that, to get out of that middle space, what they have to rely on is their advanced semiconductors. It's ultimately their ability to make the cutting edge chips at a faster pace than anybody else that's going to make them the victor in the end. And what that does is that takes them away from competition with Apple, because Apple is their buyer. Apple's buying the chips, and that puts them into competition with TSMC and with the Taiwanese firms mainly. So to get back to the answer to your question, what's happened over the years, especially under Ijeong, is that Samsung has realized that, it cannot be just a premier smartphone brand. That's what they've wanted in the past. What they've realized is that they have to be a semiconductor company. They are a designer and manufacturer of semiconductors, and they have more know-how, more intellectual property than almost any company in the world. But what that means is that, they're not competing with Apple anymore. They're competing with TSMC, and they're competing with SK Hynix, and they need to stay in that area because that's where the demand is into the future.
Would you say that Samsung's global competitiveness is weakening?
I think that the company is still extremely competitive. I mean, it's a global firm. It's, one of the Fortune 100 firms, and I don't think it's going anywhere. I think that the success, the balance sheet success, the profits that they're making, I think that's going to continue into the long term, and they are going to be successful. I just think that the brand name is not where the future success is. It's not the brand name, but it's the behind the scenes components. It's the materials that the typical consumer does not see. And that's what's happening now. I think that's what, Ijeong has realized, that, Samsung, they can make a great smartphone. They have everything they need to make an incredible smartphone, but the smartphone market is maturing. It's slowing, and it's been slowing for a long time. Smartphones are getting easier to make. They're getting less competitive. They're getting cheaper. There are changes happening now with artificial intelligence that might shift the entire smartphone market together. I mean, there are new products coming out that promise to end the smartphone and to make us rely less on our screens and less on these devices, and be able to simply walk around with an AI assistant in our pocket that will tell us, what we need to do, that will make our phone calls for us. Samsung realizes that, and I think they've realized for a long time, this is based on my interviews with many executives, they've come to the realization that, they don't have the abilities in software to make that happen. They can keep investing in AI, they can acquire some of the best AI firms out there, but they just don't have the corporate structure, the corporate culture that allows for software to flourish. They are a manufacturing company ultimately. And what that means is that, consumer brands like the consumer brand of the Samsung phone, the Galaxy phone, it means that that's not going to be as much of the future. It's going to be those chips, like I mentioned before. It's going to be the cutting edge advanced chips, so what they would call low nanometer chips. These are chips that are used to power AI solutions. This is a chip that a major company, like, a company that's betting on AI, so OpenAI. So, for example, a guy like Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI, announced his $7 trillion plan to build a semiconductor business. He wants $7 trillion to invest in that. Semiconductors take a very long time to create. I mean, that would be a decades-long investment. And for somebody like that to be smart, he wouldn't just be building his own chips, he would be looking to invest in companies such as Samsung or SK Hynix, in exchange for maybe a technology transfer, in exchange for access to the intellectual property. So what I'm getting at is that this is the true power of Samsung going into the 21st century. The power of the smartphone is fading, but the ability to make a chip that can power the AI of the future, the robotics of the future, that's going to be where they win. But that's not where a brand name is, because that's not what consumers see.
Even though it's still one of the leading companies in semiconductors, Samsung is evaluated to be struggling as the memory chip market has been experiencing a downturn, and it's also facing intense competition from TSMC. And TSMC actually surpassed Samsung in the semiconductor sales, and it produces over 90% of the most advanced chips used in AI, self-driving cars, among many other things. So how do you assess Samsung's competitiveness in the chip industry right now?
So Samsung is having a lot of trouble in memory chips, and everybody's having a hard time right now in memory chips. Part of the reason is because memory chips are a commodity. They are more easily made. So these are DRAM chips. These are a different type of chip from the cutting edge material that would be used for other purposes. The major profits are coming from non-memory chips, and non-memory chips. So these would consist of logic, what they're called logic chips. These are the types of more advanced chips that will be used more deeply in artificial intelligence and in robotics and, say, electric vehicles. Some of the more cutting edge technologies out there will depend on non-memory chips as opposed to memory chips. The problem with the memory chip industry is that there is a massive oversupply right now. So what's the solution to this? Ijeong did announce a few years ago a plan to invest billions of dollars in non-memory chips for AI, for robotics, for the kinds of applications that we're going to need in a decade or 2 decades. And that was a very smart move. I mean, I think that's a sign that under his leadership, Samsung might have a strong future, just because he's able to make these investments. I think that we need to look more at non-memory chips and study, stay focused on the market there. The market for memory chips will improve, and Samsung will come out of this because it goes in cycles. There will be fewer chips in the future, which will raise prices and make this profitable again. And then on top of that, I would say I've visited TSMC. I've spoken with many of the senior executives at TSMC. I was in Taiwan last March, visiting all of their campus in Hainan. One of the things that they said is that they deeply respect the Korean firms. They deeply respect Samsung. Not only that, but it's a kind of fearful respect. Like they know how powerful and influential these companies are, and they know what they're capable of. They did not say the same for American companies. They were making fun of Intel. They were making fun of like American chip makers because they're so far behind and they're just so wasteful and they're just getting free government money right now. I mean, they were just making like every conversation we had in Taiwan was like making fun of American companies, but then praising Korean companies. And I think that's a sign where the times are right now and what is going to be happening in the near future. It's going to be a major competition between Korean firms and Taiwanese firms.